Welcome to NCIX Tech Tips. Today's episode is all about how to build a small, quiet, and yet very powerful ITX gaming machine. When building a small form factor gaming system, the first thing is finding an enclosure that's small form factor. We decided to go with the Silverstone FT03-MINI. This is an ITX case that has a very unique internal layout. There's a single 140mm air penetrator fan in the bottom that channels air up through the anodized aluminum, thick anodized aluminum, incredibly well-built chassis, all the way to the top, where it is exhausted, and that is where your I/O is as well. So the motherboard is actually rotated in much the same way as their Fortress FT01 or their Raven RV02 series case. Very, very cool stuff. We've also gone with the ultimate ITX ASUS motherboard. This guy right here is the P8Z77-I Deluxe. It is an ITX board that supports the fastest 3770K processor on LG1155, 2 DIMM slots, which will be loading up with 16 gigs of RAM, PCI Express 3.0, which will be populating with a Radeon 7970, built-in Wi-Fi, built-in WiDi, which means you can do wireless display, SATA 3, all the features you've come to expect and more, including the beefiest power delivery I have ever seen on an ITX motherboard. It needs its own daughter board in order to have this thing present on the motherboard itself. Crazy, awesome, awesome motherboard. Next is the 3570K. So we've decided to go with the 3570K since this is sort of a value optimized gaming build in an ITX enclosure we're going for here, and the 3770K doesn't contribute that much more to the gaming experience. Last but not least, we have gone with a Silverstone 450 watt 80 plus gold fully modular power supply. This is the, this was upside down the whole time. This is the ST455FG, and it is freaking awesome. 80 plus gold efficiency, which is what allows it to deliver 450 watts with only an 80 mil cooling fan in this tiny, tiny form factor. And last but not least, a crucial M4 SSD, because anytime you're building a silent, efficient gaming machine, you want to make sure you have an SSD in there. The case supports up to 2 SSDs plus an additional 3.5-inch drive for storage. Step 1 of any assembly process is tearing down the chassis down to its bare components. So we take off the I/O cover, we pull off these panels on the back and the front, being careful not to touch the surfaces of them unless we're wearing gloves, because this is anodized aluminum and you don't want to stain it. So there's the cover for the front. Next, once those are off, very solid. I mean, listen to the sound as I put it down. Very nice. Love Silverstone build quality. Then we can, I think the sides actually stay on. So the sides stay on, and inside we find the manual, which will be very important for a complicated build like this, as well as all the hardware we're going to need to put this system together. And as Slick pointed out to me, one more of the panels actually does come off, which leaves us with just one panel left on the motherboard so we can access all the different parts of the system. In the next step, we have the motherboard set up on the motherboard box, which is a very convenient non-conductive test platform. All we have to do is align the backplate for our CPU liquid cooler that we're going to be using. Did I mention this was a liquid cooling small form factor gaming rig? Install our CPU. So this is a 3570K. All you got to do is lift up the arm. We've done a more complete system build guide, so on this one we're going to be mostly focused on the special things about an ITX build and less focused on things about sort of general system building. You can see that we've gone with higher profile RAM than we would normally do with a build like this, and if we were using an air cooler, we'd want to go with low profile RAM so we could use a bigger air cooler. Because we're using liquid cooling, we don't have to worry about it, because all liquid coolers, or these pre-done liquid coolers anyway, use nice low profile water blocks that are very, very easy to accommodate with other components that are close to them. Now, in order to install the radiator, which is really cool in this case because it actually uses the airflow from the air penetrator fan in the bottom to cool it almost incidentally, because that fan is also the entire airflow for the entire case. Now, what's cool about air penetrators is that it's very directed airflow. So with most kinds of fans, this sort of concept with a 140 millimeter radiator somewhat lined up with a 140 millimeter fan somewhat aligned with a 120 mil radiator, that wouldn't really work. But because air penetrators have a directed channel of airflow, most of the airflow will go through the rad. Now, again, I'm not focused on the things that you guys should already know anyway, like how to install the I/O plate in your case. So I've already done that. But all I'm going to do here is I'm going to align the ITX motherboard in the motherboard tray. Then I'm going to take my rad right here, and I'm going to put it down in the bottom of the case where there are 4 raised, I want you guys to see this, where there are 4 raised bumps here. There we go. A little bit tricky. 4 raised bumps, perfectly positioned to mount a radiator and then put the 140 millimeter air penetrator back over top of it where it will get most of the airflow. So I want you guys to see how that works there. And then we're going to go ahead and secure everything off camera. Now, one tricky thing with this motherboard is that because ITX boards only have 4 mounting screw holes, and this daughter PCB board here that delivers all the power for this beastly board uses 2 of them to secure itself to the main motherboard, what you want to do is you remove these nuts from the bottom. Then you have to figure out if your case uses a coarse thread or a fine thread screw to screw into the standoffs, and then you may have to replace them with the screws that come in the little baggie with the motherboard. So that means because this case uses fine threaded screws, I just have to remove these 2 screws, remove these 2 nuts, and then replace them with the fine ones before I can screw the motherboard into the case. After you put in the longer screws here for the daughter board power PCB, you have to uninstall the 4 screws here for the optical drive cage, just like that. This allows you to remove it, which gives you access to the other 2 mounting screws on the motherboard itself. So those ones, you use the ones included with your case to secure the ITX motherboard to the chassis. The next stage is pretty simple. So we noticed that there's an SSD mount here along with the SSD mount that's built into the optical drive cage that we pulled out before. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to use that one because it's a little bit less accessible than the one that's there if we ever wanted to upgrade the SSD later. Now you'll notice the 3.5-inch drive cage is here, which you can easily install your 3.5 drive into at this point in the assembly process if you had one. We actually don't have one. So all we need to do is take our SSD, line it up with the mounting holes, screw it in, and throw that whole sled back into the bottom of the case, and then use the thumb screws to secure it. Now that our SSD is installed, all we did was run a short run SATA cable over to the SATA 3 6 gigabit per second slot. Now it's time to secure the radiator and the fan. So that's in there securely. Also, we plugged the pump into the CPU fan header on the motherboard in order to make sure that it turns on, which will be good so that the CPU itself doesn't completely burn out the instant we turn the computer on. So let's go ahead and screw the screws that were included with the radiator itself into the bottom of the case. Now, the reason these holes are recessed is because it has to maintain a nice flush surface for that AP 140 millimeter fan to mount to. So these are in here so that once we put the fan over top, it won't stick out at all, and these screws won't interfere with the fan blades turning. It's really important to position the AP fan correctly so that it's blowing air up from the bottom of the chassis through all the components and then out the top. So we just go ahead, point the fins in the right direction, and then position all the screws exactly where they used to be and put it back in place. So now we have gone from an air cooling optimized setup to a liquid cooling optimized setup just by adding one of these pre-done liquid cooling kits with a 120 millimeter slim radiator. Now you wouldn't have any luck putting a thick radiator in this case because, as you can see, it would interfere with the 3.5-inch hard drive cage and, well, all the other stuff here. So there's just room for a slim rad. Now we already installed the chassis fan connector, so Only 2 fans in this entire system, and only one of them's a fan, the other one's a pump. Now it's time to hook up all of our front I/O. So we unbundled these, and it's important to make sure that you're doing smart runs to all of these connectors. So we've got our USB 3, which of course Slick is going to zoom in on so that you guys can see where I'm putting it. USB 3 goes there. Then our front panel audio goes right here next to it, making sure to position the block correctly, just like that. And finally, our front panel connectors, which are all conveniently labeled because this is a premium ASUS board, so there are labels built right into there. So power switch goes, power button. Wow, they changed up their nomenclature a little bit. So then we've got reset, and finally power LED and hard drive LED. Once these are all done, all we have to do is bundle them up really nicely and make sure that they're not going to interfere with the power supply on the case, which is going to go right here at the back of the chassis. So we're going to take all these and kind of put them here above the CPU socket where they're not going to interfere with anything. Now that we've done most of the tricky small connectors, we want to do some of the bigger ones, which of course Slick is going to zoom in on so that we can make sure that we don't miss any of the intense plugging in action that's going on in here. So first is the 24-pin connector, which as you can see is already quite restricted. If you didn't already recruit someone with small hands to help you, I would recommend finding a small child to assist you with certain aspects of this build if you have big man hands, which I do not. So I'm going to go ahead, plug in that 24-pin connector, and you can see it has a nice short cable because it's designed for systems like this, which is great. So we're going to run that to the power supply once we install it. Next is the 8-pin connector. 8-pin connector, again, is a little bit tricky to install as long as you don't have large hands. So we're going to go ahead and get that in there. This power supply is so awesome. Comes with a split 4+4-pin connector, which can make plugging it into an 8-pin a little bit trickier than it would otherwise be. But the flexibility that you get by doing it that way is more than worth it. And I finally got it. So same thing, this one is going to be brought over here to plug into the power supply once we're done. And we're ready to throw in the power supply, so we did plug in a SATA connector to our SSD drive, and there are a couple of more connectors that we are going to have to put in, but we're not going to do those just yet for a reason that will become apparent soon. So, well, actually I'll just tell you now, because we can't really route those cables until the power supply is actually plugged into the system. So you can see our SFX power supply takes up only a very small portion of the top of the case. We are orienting the fan in a downward, sort of toward the CPU socket direction so that it gets as fresh airflow as it can. Remember guys, these small form factor machines can get a little bit cramped inside. However, I think that you're going to be pretty impressed with the temperatures that we're able to achieve. So 4 screws go into there we go, the power supply, and I hope you guys can see this, because now we're going to take all of these connectors that we ran before, and we are going to plug them into the power supply. You can tell already that this power supply is basically perfectly optimized for this particular case. See that? Just barely enough room to plug in everything that we need. The 24-pin was the tightest squeeze I've ever encountered on a case and power supply combination, so unless you're using a power supply, well, I guess if it was non-modular, you might not run into as much difficulty, but the modularity is sweet, except for the fact that we ended up plugging in every connector on the modular power supply. So take it for what it is, but it's 80+ gold either way, so we still think it's ballin'. This piece right here is pretty straightforward. All you gotta do is take your optical drive, slide it in from the outside, screw it in from the side, and put it right back where we got it after you install the power connector, which then plugs into a mITX connector on the power supply itself, and pre-wire your PCI Express connector, which is going to have to go over to your video card. Now, I'm not going to lie, this machine pretty jam-packed in there. So now you can see we've actually plugged in our final modular connector. So we're using mITX to the adapter for our slimline slot loading optical. Then we have screwed the whole thing back in place. So everything is in here. There's the 2.5-inch SSD mount. There's the 3.5-inch mount that we didn't use. And you can see this guy is packed. We still have to put a graphics card in here. It's at the point now where I can say with a pretty high level of confidence, you don't want to use an air cooler in this case. You want to use a slim 120mm radiator water cooler to make sure that CPU gets enough cooling, because around the edges here, I'm just going to hold this up by this part here. Around the edges here, you're going to get enough airflow for that PCB, so that's going to be fine. Over here, you're going to get some incidental airflow from the fan for your graphics card, so that'll be fine. But right in there by the CPU socket, it's pretty tight. You want that CPU block taking care of the cooling for it. So the last thing we need to do is put in our... Did we pick a graphics card that was too long? Okay, we'll go find a different graphics card. Now we're going to go with a GTX 670 instead. You can see that it is still a very, very tight fit as we put this into the system. So I'm just going to make sure that we're lined up correctly with the rear I/O. Okay, lift her up a little higher there. There we go. Make sure we're not breaking anything as it goes in. Okay, almost there. Got that aligned. And aligning with the PCIe slot, which we have to kind of do through the top here. And making sure nothing's interfering. Down it goes. Did we get it? Yeah, we got it. So you want to use a graphics card that is, no, it's okay. You can still look at this. You want to use a graphics card that uses a blower design. You don't want to use a dual fan arrangement like this because the air will have nowhere to go once you put that side panel, which is solid, back on here. You need rear exhaust from your graphics card to make sure the heat goes out, and the exhaust has to go out the rear of the graphics card because, remember, the only intake is from this fan in the bottom here. So that is the way that this fan is going to get some airflow from here and around the top and make sure that that GPU stays cool enough to function. You also want to be careful not to go with a graphics card that has like a long plastic shroud hanging off the back, because that's going to cause clearance issues as well. So GTX 670, at the time of making this video anyway, would be my #1 pick for what to use for this small form factor build. And of course, you will need to plug in the power connectors, which is going to be, again, extremely tight, but we will figure it out. So guys, that was a bit of a struggle, and I apologize for making a mistake on the length of the graphics card there, but we are finally done. This is pretty much, look at this, it's only about the size of my head. Like, in terms of internal dimensions, it's not actually that much bigger than a gaming laptop, right? Like, seriously, think about it. Like a G75? What do you think, Slick? Like, it's seriously a ton of power considering the form factor, which is very, very cool. So now it is time to close this bad boy up and find out just how rockin' and awesome it is. We're almost done, guys. Closed up all the side panels in the same order that they were in before. It's cool because this case uses sound dampening foam to avoid causing any vibration from these side panels, which, as you can imagine, since 3 of them come off, could be a little bit of a vibration hazard if it wasn't for the fact that they had those noise dampeners. So we've covered it up. Now what we do is we take our top cover here, which is very loosely graded so that it has lots of room for ventilation out the top, and we have officially put the entire system inside this tiny little box. So the way that you get your cables into the back of the chassis is through this gap right here. So we're going to do the power cable right now, just to give you guys some idea how that's going to work. So we just go ahead like that. There you go. And we tuck that in there, plug it into the back of the power supply. Then we cover the whole thing. And the one last step I want to show you guys to make it truly small, silent, and high performance is the step to change the fan profiles to silent in the BIOS. We're not doing any overclocking in this particular build guide, although we could once we check out our CPU temperatures and make sure everything's okay, because this motherboard is fully capable of overclocking that unlocked K-series CPU. Idle temps were around 30 degrees on the CPU and just over 33 degrees on the, well, just over 30 degrees, 33 degrees on the GPU. Now that we're running FurMark MSI Combustor, which is based on Furmark, as well as Prime 95 Small FFT. Our hottest core is 50 degrees, our GPU is running at 81 degrees, and we are maxed out in terms of temperatures. That means not only is the system ready for gaming right now, we could also probably overclock both of those parts a little bit, because the system is still running quite cool and quite quiet, especially considering, here we go, we got some, we got some Witcher to run here, especially considering the kind of space that it's operating within. So this is pretty much going to be the last shot here, guys, where we show off some in-game with Witcher 2 running at pretty much max settings. Very cool stuff. Again, considering the size of this machine. I know that's been basically the thing that I've said over and over and over again, but I can't make that point enough. So we're going to get out of the game. The peasants want us to leave them alone or something like that. Leave us alone! You've bothered us enough. Don't you know what we've been through? Okay, enough of that. So our GPU temperature maxes out around, oh, that's power percentage, around 76 degrees in an actual game, and our CPU temperature apparently doesn't care at all that we're running a game, so it's still around 30 degrees. So it was very artificial, those temperatures we were seeing before when we had Prime 95 and Combustor running. Worst case scenario. Thank you for checking out this episode on how to build your own mini ITX gaming PC featuring the Silverstone FT03-MINI. Don't forget to subscribe to NCIX Tech Tips for more videos like this from your favorite e-tailer, NCIX.com.